morning is to use this conversation. Do not walk out of here and go on with the rest of your SPI. Use this conversation to answer "this is why" for your action. So as I said, it's critical that we take this conversation outside of our solar circle. I love the solar circle, but we talk to each other enough, which is why I'm so thrilled to have such an exciting panel. So with that, as I said, they're experts in communications and marketing, and they're going to help us understand how to move people and execute these smart kind of campaigns. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Omar Johnson, Matthew Lewis, and Jen Psaki. Welcome, 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 welcome. Hello, hello, hello. Hi. Wherever you like. So good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I am so glad that you're here. Obviously, I hope my enthusiasm was evident in my welcome. But we are excited. So this is my solar family.
I love it. Hello,
and
solar family.
I love the fact that you don't know them. I think that is one of the best parts about this conversation. So friends, I've invited each one of our panelists to sort of set the stage for themselves. They have an incredible background, which they'll share with you, and talk a little bit about how you think about communication. So each one of them is going to do that, and then we're going to have a conversation. So Omar, would you like to go first?
Thank you. I appreciate that. So first, thanks for having me, and thank you.
Pleasure.
I'll give you a little bit of background on me, and then I'll share a little bit about how I look at communications and marketing, and then I'll pass it off. My background's pretty simple. I grew up in New York, so just track the map with me. Grew up in Brooklyn, moved down to Atlanta, went to college there, moved from there back to Philly, then to Portland, Oregon, which I spent some time with a company called Nike. And then here in LA, I've been working with a company called Beats by Dr. Dre, and then Apple shortly after. But I've sort of crisscrossed the entire country, right? I've lived on the East Coast and West Coast. I fell in love with this whole idea of 72 and sunny, which I experienced, which you guys are experiencing right now, which is amazing. And I've been here ever since, and that I'll ever leave. Marketing for me has been an interesting journey because my resume is pretty simple. I was at Coca-Cola, Kraft Foods, I worked on Chips Ahoy. Campbell's Soup, I worked on Pace Salsa, which was actually in the Campbell's Soup company. I can tell you way more about rodeos than any other black guy can tell you. From that to Nike, and in Nike I worked on basketball and running. So, and I'll draw these really interesting contrasts, but if you think about basketball, which tends to be very African American, if you think about just jogging and running, which tends to not be. So we got to see two different sides of the house at Nike. And then with Beats, I was the third employee. And I got brought in to lead the communications function, lead marketing as the vice president of marketing. And we, just to give you a couple of quick stats on Beats, I think I was a third employee. When I left, we had about 600 employees. We literally became #1 in North America. And then shortly, we took #1 in over 35 countries. All of this happened in a span of about 6 years. My team, 55% female. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, purple hair, blue hair, no hair, tattoos, piercing. So it looked like the world. But I do credit a lot of our rapid success and the fact that we moved that company so fast to the women in the brand. Again, we were a majority female team. And the collective instinct that brought our marketing was pretty astonishing. What I learned in all of those companies, the messages were few, and you'll hear me come back to them a few times today. One is simplicity in your marketing. So Abby mentioned that earlier, and I think it's something that we all overlook. We take tons and tons of information, data, research, and we analyze it. Unfortunately, by the time you end up analyzing it, you start using words like integrate and amplify and accelerate. The challenging thing with those words are they don't really mean much anymore. Right? They don't really mean much to smart people because we all hear them every day. And the people who don't have a lot of education, they really don't mean anything. And if you look at some of the biggest brands on the planet, and you look at their taglines, they're all very simple. 1 and 2 syllable words. Okay? Just do it. Got milk. Finger looking good. Okay? All very, very simple, easy to understand taglines. And when you think about the magic of those taglines, is of course they work in the big populous states, the DCs, New Yorks, Floridas, but they also work across the middle. And it's something that from all of those brands that I mentioned, I've seen them use really simple communication. There's a lesson I learned at Beats that I think has probably become one of the most resonant ones, especially now, which is how do you use emotion to communicate, right? We all get this, we're all taught to use data. Hard-hitting headline, stat, and then you back up the stat with some information. And I think when you look at the brands that are really winning in the world today, marketing-wise, they tie emotion into what they're doing. And when you tie emotion to things, you start to take rationality out of things and move people towards your brand. And again, I think I can name tons of brands that they're totally irrational purchases, but we buy them because they connect with us emotionally. We always try to make Beats. If you look at Beats communication, we never talked about how loud, noise cancellation, battery life. We talked about things like show your color, hear what you want, got no strings, block out the haters, block out people that you don't want to hear. We use very simple language, and we also use emotion that people have every day to communicate that brand. And I was at Nike for a long time, and I never really realized that Nike was doing that until I got outside of Nike and had to do it on our own. But Nike's done it. A lot of really great brands start to bring emotion, not just data. And what I uncovered as I went down that journey is when you use information, your competitor has slightly different but the same information. So basically it's this race to who's going to better each other on information. Who's at 95%? Who's at 96%? Who's at 97%? That changes by day. But when you can put an emotional flag in the ground, and again, there have been some great companies that do this, you start to get out of that fray, and you start to talk to people in a very different way. The last thing, I think, which is probably the most complex one, but it'll sound very simple when it comes out, is how do you make your brand give people identity, okay? A lot of us this morning are walking around with cups of coffee. Are we? No. I see a few. Where do those cups of coffee come from? What color is the straw? Right. But there's tons of coffee you could have had this morning. But we identify with the Starbucks coffee in the cup, and we hold it with a little bit of pride that we care about our coffee. When you watch brands instill identity into things, I'll give you a really bad one that was good in the beginning and turned bad. Think about Live Strong with Lance Armstrong. Those little yellow bracelets. They were little and they were simple, but they gave people an identity and they gave people an ability to say, I care. I care about cancer survivorship. I care about the cause. We were talking about the ALS Challenge. Right? These are things that people were able to outwardly demonstrate that they care. And for most people, it became a like on their Instagram feed or their Facebook feed. Not to say they really participated, but they had something to demonstrate that they care. I'll give you another pretty controversial one, which are the red hats that say, Make America Great Again, right? They follow all three rules, okay? Really simple, no big words. The biggest word in Make America Great Again is what? America. The simplest word, America, okay? You look at the ability to give emotion to it, and and I watch our president and the government do it every day. They find ways to inject they inject emotion into it, and then they've made it wearable. They made it something so that you just put on a hat, and people know your position in the world. They know what you identify with. So again, I think as we talk through today, you'll hear me kind of come back to these 3 points, 3 points I feel pretty passionate about. And I found that they work across a lot of different categories. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Abby and keep going.
Great. Thank you, Omar.
Thank you.
Matt?
Well, and Omar, I mean, you actually set me up perfectly. We did not plan this out, but you talked about emotion and identity, and that's exactly what I'm going to talk about. Maybe from a slightly different perspective, but I think that is very key. First, I'll also just talk a little bit about me. I think probably my value added here is not just that I'm a conservative columnist, but that I come from kind of a working class, white, red state Trump voting background. That's kind of where I'm from. My dad was a prison guard in Hagerstown, Maryland for 30 years. When I was a kid and I went to elementary school and they said, what do you want to be when you grow up? The number one answer was farmer. The number two answer was truck driver. I wanted to play for the Orioles. Didn't quite work out. But that gives you a sense of where I was coming from. I went to college in West Virginia. My mom now lives in Pennsylvania. She didn't just vote for Donald Trump. She drove people to the polls to vote for Donald Trump. So that gives me a little bit of a different perspective from a lot of the people that I encounter in politics that I'm talking to when I'm on CNN or writing at the Daily Beast, a little bit of a different perspective. After the election, I have a podcast like everybody else in America. I think you're required to have one at this point. And after the election, I asked my mom, I had her on as my guest, the only time I've done that, and I said, why would you vote for Donald Trump? And I was really curious because, number one, my parents brought me up in a Christian background that cared about things like virtue, and I was like, Donald Trump, really? You voted for him? And also, my mom was a working mom in like the 70s and 80s, and this was, remember the election was right after the Access Hollywood thing, and so I was asking her, how could you vote for this guy in the wake of the Access Hollywood thing? And she said, Matt, let me tell you, what people in Western Pennsylvania, where she lives at, what they care about is dignity. We want our dignity back. And I started delving into what she means by that during our podcast. And basically, it was very interesting. She was essentially telling me, liberals want to give us money. They want to give us welfare. They want to give us workers' compensation. Conservatives want us all to be entrepreneurs. They want us to like start an app or something. Like, we don't live in Silicon Valley. All we want are jobs. We want to work at the factory. That gives us dignity. That gives us purpose. And I found that to be very interesting. So like, despite my background of kind of growing up in this working class white environment, it was my mom in 2016 that taught me this lesson that I think actually really applies, believe it or not, to the discussion we're having about solar today. My mom is obviously very proud of what I do. She's proud that it's pretty, actually, being on CNN getting to talk about politics was probably less likely than playing for the Orioles, right, in my parents' mind. It was pretty amazing, and so, what happens now is that my mom, whenever I go on TV, my mom calls my aunt, and she emails. My mom had 11 brothers and sisters, and my dad had 9 brothers and sisters. So my mom calls my aunt, who emails all of them, and 137 people changed the channel from Fox News to CNN for 5 minutes while we debate, and then they all switch back over. But my mom taught me this thing that of all the books I'd read and all the politics I'd paid attention to, I didn't quite fully understand. Interestingly, there's a book that I'm reading right now by a public intellectual called Francis Fukuyama. I think you interviewed him too recently. And he has a book out called Identity. Yep. And if you read the book, it's a very good book. And when it comes to marketing, if you said, hey, Matt, I'm going to give you $10 million to try to turn this, get those red hat wearing Trump supporters to be very pro-solar, I wouldn't run commercials talking about the great things about solar energy. I would find a way to have Dan Connor installing solar panels on the Roseanne show or whatever they're going to call it now. I would find a way to get the Duck Dynasty guys putting in solar panels, in their house in Louisiana or Texas or wherever that is. I think the worst possible scenario, because remember, culture is more important than politics. Emotion and identity is more powerful than rational policy decisions. The worst possible scenario would be if there came a time when we talk about latte sipping, Volvo driving elitists, we're also talking about with their damn solar panels. That is really hard to bounce back from. I don't think there's a danger of that, by the way, not in the short term. But I guess the message I just want to leave you with, and it really reiterates what Omar said, is that we heard a lot of polling, logic, it makes perfect sense. Nobody in their right mind could be against solar. People do not operate, human beings, none of us. I'm not criticizing the red hat wearing folks out there. None of us really operate based purely on logic and reason. We operate on identity and tribe and emotion. Never forget that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to build on what Matt and Omar have said. And this should tell you something, because Matt and I, well, we know each other, but we come from different ends of the political spectrum. But I think we've had similar experiences in viewing how information is consumed in Washington and around the country. And I think what Omar said about the emotional key and the emotional movement is pivotal here. So if I were all of you, I'd be asking, why does this matter to me? It's 8:30 in the morning, I've had some coffee, I need more, and what does this have to do with my business? So I am a communications professional by trade. I worked for President Obama for 10 years, 8 on and off in the White House. I spent some time at the State Department, and I've worked in the private sector as well. And what I always tell people, especially skeptical policy experts or business folks, is a communications plan is only as good as what goal it's achieving. So, communications plans are not about having the best talking points or presenting the best graphs. They're about getting your objective accomplished. So when I went back, I call it my third tour, I guess, when I worked for President Obama. I came in and out a lot of the White House to work for him in 2015. One of the first conversations we had was, he said, Jen, I want to be the climate change president. And I said, uh-oh, you're 6 years in and you haven't talked about this a lot. And the reason he wanted to be the climate change president is because at the time, we were trying to get the Paris Climate Change Agreement across the finish line, and he needed to show the world that in the United States that this was a big priority for him, and he was probably a little, had a little bitterness about not getting cap and trade through and a variety of other things. So when I heard this, I went back to my desk and I said, okay, we're going to use his time to go do a bunch of events, like we're going to go talk about keeping our land safe and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and our carbon footprint. No, absolutely not. That was completely wrong. We had polling at the time. We did polling, and just like you all have. And polling isn't perfect, I think, as we've seen in our political world over the past couple of years. But it can be an indicator, and it can give you a roadmap or an excuse to try something new. That's how I would see it if I were you. And what we did was we looked at our polling, and for climate change, actually, there were some similarities to some of the polling that Abby talked about. Well, I thought it was, let's go hug trees and talk about protecting our land. Actually, when you're talking to just yourself, and this is a lesson I would take away for any of you or give to all of you, you're not expanding your audience, right? And even if you're in the White House and you don't have money, you're not winning because you're trying to influence a larger group of people. So what we learned was that if we wanted to impact or reach suburban women, we needed to talk about health. This is a similar finding. We need to talk about the impact of clean air and clean water on asthma and children's health. If we wanted to talk to a lot of the voters that Matt talked about, and people in this country who should care about climate change because it impacts drought and flooding and their crops, then we needed to not talk about climate change. We needed to talk about the changing climate. Now that sounds a little bit absurd, but climate change to people became, like I hope solar energy does not, became synonymous with latte-drinking liberals who liked avocado toast and were socialists and supported a president from Kenya or whatever. So that was not where we needed to be, even working for President Obama at the time. We needed to figure out how to expand our audience and appeal in a way that was actually impactful. The second lesson I think I learned from my time working in government and is similar to what you all have talked about, which is there are effective ways to communicate. You want to communicate the right way, and data does not drive people. People drive people. So I love data just like anybody else. I've lived in Washington for almost 20 years. I love data and charts. But when I was in the White House in the early stage, we were communicating about healthcare. And so this is now 10 years ago. I will blame it on that. We learned a lot of lessons over the course of time. But how we sold healthcare was we talked about bending the cost curve. I don't even know what that means today, but that is what we talked about. Cost savings, you will save money, people will save money. That is impactful for some things, but for healthcare, it was not moving anybody emotionally. It wasn't talking about saving people's lives, how people would have healthcare coverage that didn't have it before, how you would cover your kids who were coming out of college. So in the beginning stages, we threw out so many charts and graphs and data. We thought that was going to win the argument. It did not. It was not. The way we saw healthcare move was when we started talking about people, and we told human stories, and we told stories of people whose lives were saved. It was our version of the Dan Connor on the roof. That is how we saw people being moved, because charts and data over social media just is not how, it doesn't register with the American public how, I think most of us rational people think it should. The third lesson is for all of you as you're thinking about how to apply this is your audience. I currently work at a global think tank that focuses on foreign policy with wonderful people who focus on things like missile defense in China. And they'll say to me, I want everybody in the United States to know about what I'm working on. And I say, those people everybody does not care about missile defense in China. So obviously your audience is much, much larger than that, but the key is who are the audiences that you need to reach your goal? So is it expanding your market share in the Midwest? Is it creating more urgency for suburban moms who should put solar panels on their house? Is it reaching underserved communities? How do you focus on those specific communities? It's not everybody. There's almost honestly no issue that everybody needs to know about or everybody cares about. So I would certainly suggest being narrow in how you think about your audiences. The last thing I would say is sometimes when you have new information, which is a huge opportunity, you have to throw out your old assumptions, including about how you reach people, because I think as everybody here knows, the way people consume information has changed dramatically over the course of time. And it's not just people get news on their mobile devices. That is absolutely true. But it's not as if everybody is sitting down at night waiting for the evening news to come on. It's just not the lives most people live anymore. So that requires kind of throwing out your assumptions about how the message about the solar industry should be transmitted to people. One of the things we did on healthcare that got a lot of criticism, I'm not suggesting it's right for all of you, but just as an example, was we had President Obama sit down with Zach Galifianakis, which everybody thought was absurd at the time. It wasn't presidential. It was all of these things. The goal there was we wanted to reach young people who we wanted to sign up for healthcare, and it worked. Because young people care about Zach Galifianakis' humor and they look it up on their mobile device. So the key lesson I learned over the course of the last 10 years and seeing how media changed was that you need to meet people where they are. They're not going to come to you. There are too many choices out there and too many options for how people consume information. So it might be the Dan Connor commercial. I think we're all endorsing that. I don't know if he'll do it.
Go John Goodman.
Yes, exactly. John Goodman will be happy to hear it. But it's thinking along those lines so that people are consuming information where they least expect it, and they're learning about your industry and the benefits in a way that doesn't feel political or poll tested. It feels like something they're experiencing in their daily lives.
And so I hope now you see why these folks are here, because I can tell you, in the solar industry, we really excel at conferences. And so we sit around and talk to ourselves a lot, and we have exactly 0 times ever had a conversation like this. So thank you. For the next 35 minutes, we're going to continue this conversation and really encourage a dialogue between us. I would say, so I've been furiously taking notes over here, the thing that is sort of the most radical when I think about solar is focusing on the emotion. I mean, You totally nailed me, and totally appropriately, right? I love charts, I love graphs, I love data, I love messages that are really gonna work. There's not a word about emotion, right? And so I would be really curious, you all have such different perspectives. Give us some advice as we think about sort of the emotion of solar. Sort of what does that mean to you as people from different perspectives? And what advice might you have for us for evoking that emotional response?
Want to start?
I'll start.
Go for it.
So I think when I watch industries use emotion, they tend to get to really simple ones. You look at, some of the political parties right now, fear is a big one. They use fear, right? The fear of this whole new world versus the old world that we all grew up in. And I think when you look at whether it's fear, people's families, you think about just the way to connect with something beyond data. So it's funny because they just mentioned they're from two separate sides of the political spectrum. I think we'd all say we're pretty strong capitalists, right? We all want to make more and take more home. How do you appeal to those things, right? Every one of us has a little bit of want more for ourselves. The bad word for it's greed, but we all want more for ourselves and our families. How do you weave those things into your messaging? So it's not just about data, because I think that in living in the information age, the last thing you're gonna win on is data. There's so much flying at us from so many different perspectives that the moment you give me compelling data, there's something to offset it elsewhere. So how do you get the things that I think about when I'm alone, when I'm with my family, when I'm like driving in my car? And those are the things that I think matter a lot more. So everything that you spoke about, you started to get down the road of, you think about farmers and what they care about. That's their history, that's their family, that's good memories. That has nothing to do with logic. It's just what they experience in this world. I think about climate change. I love that little tweak on climate change versus changing climate. There's these big themes that become euphemisms, right? So climate change is one. I'll give you another one that impacts my life. Diversity. There's a lot of diversity fatigue, right? The word's a euphemism now. But what does it really mean? And I think until we start to bridge those gaps with really simple emotions, people have lost the meaning with them because they're bombarded and thrown at us every day as these big words. So again, unfortunately, I think greed, fear are really powerful emotions. You gotta be careful with how you wield them, but they work, right? Trying to get to warm and fuzzies, every brand is trying to get to warm and fuzzies. So warm and fuzzies don't work as much as sort of everybody wanting a bit more for themselves, people thinking about their past and how they grew up. Those are the things that you want to try and connect with. Politically, I think what's also interesting is we tend to draw these lines, red states, blue states. We look at the coast in one way, the middle states a different way. I had a technology guy say to me 5 years ago, he said, you don't have a hit product until you get 1 million people to buy your product. You typically can't aggregate 1 million people to buy one thing on just the coasts. You typically can't aggregate it just in the middle. You need both. So when you think about hit products, and any hit product you can name in this country, it's probably consumed by both people in the middle and people on the outside. I always knew with Beats, it wasn't about New York and California. It was about the middle states also. We would demonstrate in our election that you can't do it with just the coasts. So back to the emotion piece, when you can tie really simple emotional messages, they tend to break through whether it's red or blue, black or white, young or old, because emotion is emotion is emotion. And again, it tends to be a little bit harder to get to because it's not right there in front of you as far as data. But when you can start to crack into that emotion, I think you start to get to really resonant messages.
Yeah, I think that the fear factor is spot on. Because look, we could all take the bullet points that are very impressive but sterile, and we could start to craft, let's say, a TV commercial around those bullet points. So instead of telling people you're going to save money, we could do a commercial with a young lady who's going to college because the money that was saved from energy now can go toward it. We could do those sort of touchy-feely commercials, but I think you made a very valuable point, which is everyone nowadays gets that. Like, this was maybe cutting-edge information 10 or 15 years ago, everyone knows how to run a puff piece and make, Brett Kavanaugh taught girls basketball or something. We know how to do the positive piece. I think the thing that's changed in the past couple years is the fear factor has been heightened.
Yeah.
And that could partly be because we're living in a post 9/11 era and a post Great Recession era. People feel scarcity. I think there's times when people feel prosperous, then they're more generous in giving. Right now, people, especially the Trump voters that I'm representing a little bit here today, they feel the scarcity that leads to hoarding. You're sort of less gracious. And so I think fear is a driving component. And the danger is, and where the fear comes in basically is a tribalism. It's us versus them. Yep. And the real danger is that Donald Trump has taken the NFL, and made them, yeah. Which if you think about is an amazing accomplishment. I mean, 5 years ago, there was nothing more kind of like conservative, Republican, patriotic, all American than football. And if you look at, I hate to go back to polling, but the numbers that I'm seeing, a lot of Trump voters are turning against the NFL. If he can do that, then any industry, I think, is in danger of being on the wrong side of once one tribe decides you guys are for those other people and those other people hate us, they're against us, it's super hard to come back from that. And I think, so as much as I love to talk about the positive aspects of emotion, I actually think the fear is the most compelling right now.
Yeah, I think as a marketer, I'm gonna be short with this. As a marketer, you gotta be really humble. If you think your message matters more than what our president's saying, more than people worried about putting food on the table for their kids, worried about their jobs, it's not. You've got to take that into account when you think about your messaging, because all of that lives around in way more than whatever you're going to say about solar or any other industry. So your messaging has to atone to what's happening in the world. And I think it's a bit scary for us to sit here and we're actually saying that fear is an important factor in communications. But I think in the climate that we live in today, to your point of meeting people where they are, you have to meet consumers where they are, and if that's being propagated around them, I mean, I worry how much I admire the marketing job our president's done, because I actually think he's weaponized fear like no other.
We've also been evolutionarily trained to respond to fear, and it's because if we were all back in the caveman days, and somebody came up to us and said, hey man, there's a saber-toothed tiger coming. And I was like, come on, that's fake news. I'm tired of this negativity. And you guys were like, I'm out of here. Which of us would be Which of us would be more likely to pass on our genes to a future group of fearful Americans?
So I have a little bit more of a positive spin on this, just because I think we need to elevate it a little bit. I think fear is also about urgency. And so what I think an issue may be, to the degree you have one, because people love solar, so that's a good basis to start from. That is not true of many industries, is why do we need to act now? And what we've seen in the political climate is that people act when there's an urgency, when they feel like something is going to be taken away from them, when they feel like the opportunity is in front of them at that moment. So I agree, I have admiration as well for the marketing genius. But if you look at an issue like healthcare right now, well, it was hugely unpopular 5-6 years ago. I'm talking about the healthcare, the Affordable Care Act. Now you have people like Senator Joe Manchin in West Virginia, who is in a very red state, running on healthcare, because it's not a political issue as much anymore. It's about people having healthcare taken away from them or their access taken away from them. So that is a version of fear, but is more about the urgency of acting because it's going to impact a person and their family and their well-being. The other piece I would just add is accessibility, because people are living busy lives. You all are, people out in the country are, especially people who are just.
How do you share an idea? How do you kill some of the infighting on which company has the best idea and find one way to elevate it, and then you articulate it slightly differently to different audiences. But what you currently have today, it's a bunch of fragmentation. There's people talking about different types of solar, or different attributes of solar. How do you get to that very simple got milk? And then how do you articulate it differently once you get to that one single thing? My fear is if you start getting to the customization conversation too early, you continue to fragment your message. Yeah. And I think, everything we're saying kind of has a similar thread. We're saying it in very different ways. And as much as you might think you're not speaking fear, when you start thinking family and kids.
It is fear. It's a more positive spin on fear. It's the same thing.
But you need that, right? We probably went a little bit aggressive on the go hard fear, where it's just a different tone of fear, but it doesn't. But when you think about what we can do together, if we were to bring all three voices together, we could end up with a single
Uber app. But if there was only 2 people driving Ubers in your hometown, it really wasn't viable if you could just go online and have the industrial side of this. But I'm talking about you having them put in your house.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The only thing I would add is that, data, we've sort of talked about the evils of data. It's not all evil, but one other slightly evil part of data is that it has been used to segment the population in such a way that nobody knows what you're saying anymore. And I'm not saying this is applicable to the solar industry, although maybe it is, but this is certainly applicable to people running for office. It's certainly applicable to some industries where it's, I'm going to say this to African Americans, I'm going to say this to Latino Americans. And yes, I completely agree with Omar, it's slightly tweaks of things, but not entirely different messages, because then nobody knows who you are and what you stand for and why they should choose solar. And I think it doesn't have to be overly complicated. I think we keep coming back to this notion of accessibility and family and how things impact individuals. There's some interesting data from this poll that I think can be very informative and be a good trial. But the risks of data is that it gives you so much information that you want to say something very different to every population. Political candidates have made that mistake, so I would certainly encourage you not to.
No, that's good advice. And to your point, Matt, there are huge, I talked about it a little bit earlier, so there are different segments of the utility scale and commercial and residential, and we talk about those ourselves all the time, but we're talking about it as something bigger than that, right? Something broader, like a vision and a brand for solar, period. Right? Consumers don't really want to differentiate between all those things.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's good for us to hear that because we spend so much time doing all of those things. So I just want to remind all of us this way that we're talking about sort of that one solar vision. So, okay, imagine a world in which I had that $10 million marketing budget. I'm making a commercial and putting solar panels on Roseanne's house. I am hiring a few rednecks. Your word, not mine.
Yeah. What is it? Jeff Foxworthy said, you can't joke about rednecks unless you are one and I are one.
Exactly. I mean, I do love country music, so we got that. But tell me, what else should I do if I have a $10 million marketing budget? What other things? How should I spend those dollars?
Oh, at $10 million, we didn't have any money in the government.
Consultants.
So I'm like,
I would say you need to hire consultants.
Yeah, no.
That's where half the money
Don't hire
should
consultants. I would say, you know what your message is, and that's invaluable. So you've already done that investment. What I think you'd want to do now is figure out what the tactics are for how you're going to get the information out. So I would spend some of the money to do some research on, you want to reach suburban women, how are they consuming information? This information is out there, but what are they reading? What are they looking at? Where can you reach them? Meeting them where they are. If you want to reach rural rednecks, your word, not mine, where are they consuming their information? It's very easy to rely on kind of the old standards of how you advertise, how you even communicate through earned media. Many people are guilty of that, and I think you need to rip up that plan and really think about, these are our 3 target audiences, here's where they consume information, we have a simple message, how are we going to deliver it to them?
I think one. So this is like a this is maybe not a $10 million. This is like.
I didn't spend $10 million.
This is $1
You have
million.
like $8 million left or 9.
But I mean, I could just tell you, this isn't sexy at all. But there's a group called the Faith Angle Forum in Washington D.C. and their mission. They noticed that reporters and opinion leaders who were writing about faith, like for the New York Times or the Washington Post, really didn't understand it because most people in the media, believe it or not, don't go to church. And they didn't necessarily grow up in families that go to church, and so it was almost like they were a foreign correspondent or like an anthropologist writing about these people who go to church on Sundays or Saturday or whenever. And the purpose of the Faith Angle Forum was to basically take opinion leaders, people who are already writing about faith. In your case, it could be energy. And they go to Miami for a couple days. They hear experts talk about it. And even more important, they get to hang out with those experts, have drinks, have dinner with them, develop a Rolodex of sources. And so whenever there's a topic about religion, not only have they kind of been briefed at this conference, and who doesn't want to go to Miami like in January, but they have a Rolodex now of not just like nameless experts, but people that I had like a mimosa with or something. And so that's a small investment, but that is the kind of thing that I think really, if you were doing a broad-based strategy that had different bullet points, I would put that in there as one of them.
Great.
Yeah, so $10 million in my world gets you. So what I tend to speak a lot about, and I think it's what's made some of the most progressive brands really powerful, there's two parts of the world. One, it's called owned media. So owned media, what does owned media mean? Your uniforms, your office, your hold music, your business cards, what people say at customer support. Think of all the things that happen in your daily operation that you can build consistency in and impart messaging to that can be repeated over and over and over again. So don't think about the money you're going to spend to outwardly bound the marketing. Think about the things you do every day, all day. UPS, brown trucks. It's been the best marketing ever. Who likes a brown truck? Nobody, but we know what the brown truck means. So when you think about what I call own media, it's how do you use those things? Your website, your social media, how is it always repeating the same simple message? And how is that message even being shared across other companies? I'd be thinking about, we've been talking about the red hats. What's the red hat pin that comes from your company that's also shared with your partner companies that you want on that red hat? That's hijacking something that's already big, emotional, people care about, people wear. It's already known behavior, and now you're putting something on top of it. So there's the own media side, then the earned media side, which is things like social media, conversation you create there, PR, news. But I would put that $10 million in those spaces because they tend to be really efficient and they move really far, and you don't have to commit a lot of dollars to you never know if it's going to hit the consumer. You're just always doing it, and it sustains over time. So I'd be thinking through the lens of owned and earned media and then finding ways to amplify that. I may be changing everyone's uniform. I may be creating a coalition of maybe 4 or 5 companies that have similar colors, right? Whatever those colors. I'm not sure what the color of your industry is, but how are we all wearing that color in some form or fashion so that color becomes iconic of what we stand for. But I'd be thinking about those things first. And the cool thing about that style of communication, it works with millennials. It also tends to work with the people who are on Facebook and doing more traditional things also. So I'd be thinking a bit more about owned and earned media, which I think we all kind of touched on, but I think tend to be really efficient versus if you got $10 million, you got 1 or 2 shots and you got to hit a target. With the owned and earned media, you can tweak it over time, you can morph it, you can trial and error, but over time, that $10 million goes a really long way.
That's helpful. That's helpful. And I really liked your point about how people consume information and sort of being really, really conscious about that as we plan how we communicate. So we're getting close to the end of our time together. It went as quickly as we thought it might. So we've talked about sort of the industry, right? The industry writ large. What can we do as an industry? And that's what we invited you here to talk about. But every single person in this room, I think, works for a company, right? Their own individual company. They are citizens in their communities. They have a family. They have elected officials who represent them in government. If you could just say one thing that you would recommend each person, right, not each industry, but each person in this room can do to sort of further our message, I think you'd find a really receptive audience to that.
I'll go first. At my church a couple weeks ago, in our Sunday school class, the teacher said, if I want to know what kind of Christian you are, they're the two most important things are how do you drive and how do you tip?
Wow.
Those are the two most important things that that sort of live your values. And because you're not necessarily going to be going up and like, brother, can I have a moment with you? And, trying to like evangelize everybody. Mostly it's people are watching how you live and what kind of person you are. And they're basing that on the entire worldview or the value set that you represent, right? And so here you're representing an industry, you're representing a form of energy. And I would say, let's go back to the original conversation where we talked about things like community and tribalism and identity. Mostly we talked about that at the macro level. How do we have the commercial with, John Goodman installing solar panels? But how do you live your life in your community? If people know, not just on the job, but how are you representing those values? And are you sneering at working class people? I doubt if anyone's doing that, but if you are, that would be a really bad, we'll use a religious term, witness on the community.
This shows my background or bias a little bit, but I would say a thing I would recommend everybody do is if you're a liberal or consider yourself on the progressive side of things or what have you, go turn on Fox News, go read a newspaper or a magazine that is not aligned with your views. If you are more of a conservative, go turn on MSNBC in your hotel room. I'm not saying the world revolves around politics. Frankly, getting out of Washington and coming here where this is a booming industry is extremely refreshing, even though I am working in politics. But we spend too little time kind of hearing the other point of view. It's hard to kind of go find a group of people who are not aligned with you. That's hard to do with busy lives. But that's an easy way to do it. I'd also go a step further. If you enjoyed your MSNBC or Fox News viewing, look up local newspapers and local television, because people still consume. Local television is still hugely popular. Even though the evening news, ratings are not what they once were, people still love their local news. They love what they talk about. It gives you the flavor of a community that you may be trying to reach, even if you're not sure what's happening there. You can find that all online, so I'd encourage you to do that. So I said that because obviously I have a media background, but can tell you a lot about how people are thinking and what's going on in their daily lives.
And let's not forget with terrestrial news, or just traditional news, that's also the content that ends up on the web. So it's, we're looking at viewership.
All of that you can find online. Sure.
Exactly. And typically, I'm a consumer of news, but I don't consume it through television. I consume it in small bits. My thought is pretty simple. So if you think about what we all spoke to, let me see the best way to say it. So here's what we tend to do as marketers or people that have to get a message out. So I'm going to borrow your paper. I'm not going to read it. We come up with this idea, and we hide it, and we're like, oh my God, I have a great idea. Can't wait to tell my boss. And we have this idea. We wait for our moment to tell our boss. And the biggest mistake we make is we don't share that idea with different people. I'm known for being in a restaurant, and we had an ad that we were working on. I'd show it to the waitress. I'd show it to the chef. I'd show it to a bus driver. I'd show it to someone who was white, who was black, who was female, who was young, who was old. And in that, you start to pick up collective intelligence about the world. Way too often, we hold these things really tight to our bodies, and we don't let people opine on them. And I think as you think about marketing in your space, how do you share, like, I'm dying to have something to share with these two and say, what do you think? Because I know I'm going to get an answer that I would never get from my friends and the people that work with me every day. And I think to the extent that you can think about that with your neighbors, your community, people you go to church with, the news example is perfect because I'll watch Al Jazeera, I've watched more Fox this year than most of my friends because I'm always looking for the opposite side of the opinion. So I think the more you can think about your message, but then put it in different audiences and ask people what they think. Ask your kids if they understand it, because if a 7-year-old understands it, there's a lot of other people who probably understand it also. If it takes a college graduate to understand it, you probably don't have a message that can apply to many people. So use the people around you to test your message and plant it. And the last thing I would say is a lot of times in these spaces, you look across the person next to you at a conference like this as competition. You're not competing against each other. You really need to find ways to find common language that can lift everyone, because as the category grows, you can all make money. If you're competing, it's a zero-sum game. What you take from her or from him comes at the expense of her and him. But if you both can get outside of yourselves and grow something, you both grow respectively. So it's challenging at times for companies to see that when your boss is saying compete, compete, compete. But there's always a bigger way to do it, which is bringing more people into your space and finding a way to make your competition a bit more of your ally. And that always happens through simplicity, repetition, and making sure you connect things emotionally.
That's awesome. So for those of you that want to continue the conversation, at noon, we have the pleasure of Jen and Matt. Omar is flying somewhere else, but Jen and Matt will be in the industry trends, Dan? Industry trends. And you can ask them any question you'd like about solar and solar messaging. And I hear they're also happy to talk about politics if you need more of that. But please join me in thanking Omar, Matt, and Jen for really thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you for attending this general session. Today's education sessions start at 9:30 on the second level of the Anaheim Convention Center, and the exhibit hall opens at 10 on the first level of the Convention Center. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning for the start of the general session at 8 a.m.